Hello, everybody. This is Rich Miller. I'm with Visible Technologies here in Seattle, and I'd like to thank you for joining our webcast today. Now, we've got a couple of people presenting today, and we're pretty lucky to have them. There are a couple of senior people here at Visible. Mike Maziarka is our Senior Director of Product Management. Now, what he's responsible for is really the roadmap, the product roadmap at Visible. So he's out there talking to the market all the time about what is going on, what needs do people have, how can we make enhancements to our platform to better serve our customers and have better things to talk about with prospects about how we can drive value with them. As you can see, he's got more than 20 years of experience in social media, content, and document management, and electronic publishing, working with companies like Symphony, BEA Systems, InfoTrends, Frame Technology, et cetera. Really fantastic guy to have on to talk about where data is now, where it's come from, where we're going. And then the other person that we've got on the phone is Steve Reeves, and Steve's a solution consultant with Visible. He's a guy that's out there every day talking to our customers and prospects about how they can use social media to help move their business forward. And talking about combining data is something that he's talking a lot with people about right now. So we're really going to look to him to give us some good insight into some of those current conversations and what people are thinking about. Steve's got a long background in social media, has been with Visible for the last couple of years, but has spent time with a number of other companies, both in and out of the social media space and the research space. So that is enough from me. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand it over to Mike, and Mike is going to walk us through some of the slides that talk about how did we get to where we are right now and what are some of the things that people really are thinking about when it comes to social analytics. Mike?
Thanks, Rich. So as Rich talked about, within our organizations, we are getting a growing number of different data sources, and we're compiling and aggregating all types of data. And some of this is externally driven, such as where in mainstream press are we being referenced through the growing amount of social media content, and some of it's internally generated as well, such as CRM data, possibly primary market research that we are investing in to collect perspective on where we're sitting in the marketplace. And as a result of this, we are growing not only separate data stores in our organizations, but in many cases also separate applications to help us generate, process, and use this data in real time. And largely, this is driven by the need to support a growing number of different use cases. So as we try to grow our business, establish new footholds in markets, to grow our presence, grow revenue associated with use of our product or services in those markets, we have different needs from a business perspective, everything from generating brand awareness to launching and executing campaigns, working on affinity marketing to really start to deepen and extend those customer relationships we have, as well as ensuring that the customers are having the best experience and interactions with us on an ongoing basis. Now, the focus on these different use cases continues to evolve, and certainly the pace of what we must do continues to escalate in these areas. And largely, this is driven by the interconnected world we now live in. The internet, use of mobile have really driven consumers to be far more educated on different market options that exist to them and how to share and exchange information to not only help them assess what products or services may meet their needs, but how others' experiences with using those products have benefited or have not benefited them in those particular cases. So as a result of this, how we look at these different use cases and what we're striving to do with them continues to evolve, and this is on numerous fronts. So first is we start to look at how we communicate out to the market. Historically, looking back 10, 20 years, the focus was on really communicating out a message that was going to that very broad marketplace. over time, we've really strived to get to that notion of one-to-one marketing, really being able to communicate effectively not only with a mass market, but increasingly towards market segments, towards influencers in the marketplace who can help carry our message, and then really striving to get to that point where we can communicate much more effectively based on an individual customer or consumer's particular needs. And likewise, this is also reflected in what we want to learn about the marketplace as well. It initially really focused on understanding the market. We talked a lot about the market, but over time we recognized that we actually in many cases serve multiple constituents or different market segments, and that each of those segments may have different needs, may think about the particular need differently, may use different language to not only talk about that need, but also what messages are going to resonate with those different market segments. And so that ability to learn how effective we are with each of those segments is now advancing to the point where we really want to assess and understand how our interactions are impacting the market. So as we're communicating with our customers or consumers, either through traditional means like a call center or through social, how are those interactions shaping not only that consumer's view of our brand and how they interact with our product, but what can we learn about that exchange in terms of how we can better serve those particular consumers, and also possibly what other unmet needs they have that we can start to service longer term. Now, as we start to look at these evolving needs and where we want to go to better handle these use cases or business needs that we have, it becomes very apparent that the only way to truly effectively do this is to break down these different data silos and application silos that we have in our organization, that we can no longer truly look at these individually to get that more holistic view of our customer and how we can better service them. So it's not surprising that a number of different analyst studies in the marketplace and a lot of the different press that we may be reading really can address these through different surveys that they have generated, and the one I have up here from Gleanser is just one example of this, and really kind of focused on social relationship management. And clearly in this case, they identified with this particular survey that the vast number of their audience really feels that to be successful there, social needs to be integrated with other enterprise data, voice of the customer data, CRM data, other information that really presents a more holistic view of that customer dialogue. So, you know, Rich talked earlier about kind of a market evolution and market maturity model in terms of where the market is, and there's many different models that exist out there, and for the purpose of this conversation today, I lifted one that I particularly liked. So in some Forrester research that was done by Eve Mailer and Kete Blue, they had this model focused on business intelligence, where it really starts out with the notion of static intelligence moving up through adaptive intelligence. And over the course of this maturity level, you're essentially moving beyond a single data source to multiple data sources, which then can be updated in real time, getting to the point where you have access to just numerous data stores that are available that you can query or interrogate into that information to get the information you're looking for. And likewise, kind of along the spectrum, the data in the static case is infrequently updated. You know, think of something that you're updating on some periodic basis, possibly survey-based data as an example, that you may look to, that you're not updating on a regular basis, but just periodically through data that's real-time. So you not only are collecting that information, but being able to access that and use that in real time to help make decisions. And consequently, as you move across the spectrum or this evolution or maturity model, the insights model also starts to evolve with that. So that you are in the earlier stage really just getting insights off of a static set of information, which as you'd recognize would change over time, kind of moving up to that notion that when you get to the adaptive stage, Insights are really kind of evolving as a part of that process of interrogating and what are you learning throughout the process. Part of what I think is intriguing about this particular model and something that resonates very well with social data is that notion of serendipity, that you are not just trying to validate an assumption when you start to look at this, but that notion that you could learn or discover new things as a part of the process really becomes a core piece of that equation. Now, part of what makes this challenging is that when we look at the different information types that we have within our organization, some of it is very structured information. You know, think of CRM data as an example. It is information that follows a certain schema that you may have. In other cases, it's unstructured information. It's text, it's narrative. It is something that needs to be mined really to pull out that base set of information. When you look at a maturity model like this, and you know, if you were to ask me where are many organizations today, I would say that most are probably in the reactive intelligence, moving up into the interactive intelligence space today, at least as where, when we look at this relative to social and the incorporation of social into the picture as a whole. I think part of the challenge as you move through this model is that in the earlier stages, where organizations really struggle a little bit and start to look at this is trying to establish what those integration points are. So whether it's structured or unstructured information, how do you associate particular aspects of that information, social as an example, with other pieces, and where does that make sense to have that intersection or that integration between the data points take place? And so there's thought that's put behind that in terms of where you can create not only that intersection, but where there may be a correlation between the different data components that we have. And I think as you start to move through this model, this starts to become less of an issue as you have that ability really to start to look at this more in real time and have the applications themselves help to drive to that point to recognize where you have those intersections or correlations within the data. Now, what benefit can you get from actually doing this? I think there's many different examples that you can think of within your organization where there's a great deal of potential around additional insight that you can gain from integrating these different data sources together. And let me just walk through a few of these. And I think ultimately around all of this, the goal is really to get to that customer centricity model that we're looking for, that our notion of how we market, how we attract and retain customers is changing over time, really focus more around that customer experience or the customer journey of interacting with us. With that in mind, we start to look at different functions or aspects of what it is we do. If it's a digital marketing, really trying to understand what drives community participation, and once there, how do you increase that interactivity? When you look at building and driving that community, you start to look at a range of different information. So some of these may be owned data that you have, places such as your Facebook fan page, possibly a community site where you're helping to drive that traffic, but there's other cases where you're not in ownership of that information. There's forums that exist out there, other social networks. Where are you placing your media spend to help drive some of that? And so when you start to look at this, it really makes sense to combine or start to integrate what you're seeing with social with other things like your community sites, with web analytics in terms of where that traffic is driving to, possibly campaign analysis to understand are particular campaigns effective in really helping to drive or build additional traffic to those particular places, as well as engagement on those particular sites. And then ultimately even sales data. How can you get to that point where you can determine that your investment in this particular area is really helping to drive sales? Switching over to brand marketing, this is another area where certainly the intersection or integration of these different data types really can help create a better perspective of what is the value of your brand in the marketplace. Where are there opportunities that should be capitalized on? And here again, it's a range of different places where you may own the data through data that exists elsewhere. So what is that intersection between mainstream press and social that's taking place? What is your market research telling you? How does that correlate with what you see in social, as well as other analysis, possibly competitive analysis that you may have done relative to how your brand is stacking up relative to others. The product area, I think this is one of the exciting areas, and we see a number of our customers really starting to have product ideation in this area. So are there unmet needs that we can discover with social when we look at that, especially in combination with things like our market research data or our CRM data? What are our customers telling us in this area? Or if we're discovering things in social, can we interact with customers in real time to make a determination as to how pervasive that need may be in the marketplace? Through customer experience, again, it's not just about being reactive and ensuring that we pick up the phone or that when somebody tweets that we can respond back in real time, but understanding what is that journey that a customer goes through and how do they transition between different channels to interact with us, and ensuring not only that we have a consistent brand image across those and a consistency in our message in response to customers, but better understanding what is that outreach from them and what are the consistencies across that in terms of what questions they're asking, are they having particular problems with our product or service, and how can we really improve that overall experience with the customer themselves. And so with that, let me go ahead and turn it over to Steve at this point to talk a little bit about an example that we've done with one of our customers.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike. I really appreciate it, and thank you for laying the groundwork really for what what will be a really, really impactful session going forward. And one of the things I wanted to touch on, we actually we're working, like you said, we're working to establish new ways to integrate, what can be, considered, own data and things of that nature, or data that is outside the realm of social analytics. And one of the case studies that we actually worked on here recently was with a major retailer. And essentially what we found was, they came to us with a particular issue, and that issue was essentially looking at specifically what's happening with regard to holiday financing offers, i.e. layaway programs. And really what we established and what we set out to do was build a framework where we had them, gather the data that they already had, right? So data on, things like traditional media or syndicated shopper research or customer shopper surveys, and things of that nature. And we were able to pair that essentially with social data. So what we did was, essentially have the ability then to mirror what they were seeing in their particular trends and things that were popping up in offline discussions and forums and things like that. And really what it allowed us to do then was to draw a correlation between the two. So some of the insights that were derived, for instance, were, what are the customer decision factors? Can we develop a deep strategy, connect with shoppers on social media? What are those key audiences that we really need to pay attention to? And so this is where, you can take your traditional research or offline data and you can pair it effectively with social data to understand what is the voice per se of a target audience group like moms in relation to layaway programs, and how does that impact them and their families in the holiday time, in the holiday seasons, extending a product boundary, and could it drive new connections? And so there are a lot of different ways that we're actually set out to draw that correlation between the two. And what we found was that there was actually, we could validate what they were seeing, as trends in their offline data with what we saw, we were able to pair with social analytics data. So for instance, understanding the voice of moms in relation to layaway programs, what trends we were seeing in terms of specific seasonality or holiday campaigns. One of the other things that we did find as well was that we had to look at how are their customers being made aware of a particular program like a layaway program. And, by and large, we found at the time that they weren't harnessing social to drive that discussion point. And from there, one of the key recommendations and one that they took advantage of was, you're building these campaigns that are speaking to particular, particular trends or particular audience groups. Now we can actually integrate in different social-driven calls to action, and that will establish more measure in terms of how we pair that social data with the offline data. So that's just a quick example. What I'm going to do now is let's go ahead and turn it back to Rich, and we'll take some questions and things of that nature. The idea here, integrating offline data sources and disparate data sources with social data, something that we are sort of scratching the surface on. We see a tremendous value, but we're really excited to be able to communicate with you all to understand, what are some of the questions that you have in relation to this topic, and sort of give my perspective on what I'm hearing from the market in general.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve. So fantastic. If there are some more questions that people have, please, again, use that Q&A panel. I think we'll address a couple of the questions that have come up in this little back and forth that we have in the voice of the market. But if you have any other questions at all, please use the Q&A. One of the questions came up with something that we want to get your perspective on, Steve, and it has to do with integrating CRM data. So we were hoping maybe you could tell us some stories about what you've heard over the last month or so, some conversations that you've had about CRM data. So the typical CRM systems is kind of a, when you think about customer support, let's focus on that for the time being. It's a mix of structured and unstructured data. Are people, what are people looking to do? Are they looking to combine unstructured data from social with unstructured data from CRM? Looking to do some structured versus unstructured? What are they thinking about in CRM?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and one that I think, from my perspective, has a couple different use cases around it. So, for instance, based upon somebody's role or function, it might take a different viewpoint. And for instance, I'm seeing a rise in the need to compare, voice of the customer data via contact center applications with, voice of the customer data out on social. And, that is really what you're talking about, or comparing, structured data, because obviously that's going to feed into a CRM. Those calls that are logged are going to have, specific types of tonalities and keywords and all kinds of things that your customers are actually speaking to you. And what we could then do is we can use that as a guidance or a measure to be able to say, okay, well, this is what we're seeing from an offline perspective, from the customer base. Does that ring true online? So if we take an unstructured approach using social data, we have a format that we can go in and we can say, okay, here are the things that we're seeing rise in relevancy and prominence offline. These are things that are being logged in our CRM, and then we can compare those to what we're seeing in trends online. So,
yeah, can I just expand a little bit on that? So what we've seen with one of our customers, to Steve's point, is not only understanding kind of where that consumer preferences in terms of what is the issue that they want to address, and are they taking that to phone versus email versus social in that particular case, and being able to do that analysis of not only topically where these are coming, but also satisfaction levels following that. One of the interesting aspects of what this particular customer that I'm thinking of is also doing is trying to understand what that journey is, recognizing that a communication may start in a particular channel, but may evolve across different channels. So they may start with social and possibly switch over to phone if it's a more complex issue, or switch over to email, or possibly out, through some other sequence there, but really trying to understand for the conversation perspective how that evolves and where the consumer kind of moves through those different channels, with the ultimate goal of really trying to ensure that they're optimizing that customer experience, recognizing that the conversation may not start and finish solely within one individual channel.
Great. Thanks for that feedback there, Mike. Another thing we wanted to get some insights on from you, Steve, is the conversations that you're having with people out there right now about combining data to validate and get deeper insight and things like that.
Yep.
Are there particular roles that are more curious about it right now than others?
Yeah, so one of the audience groups that I speak to pretty frequently are market researchers, and what they're really interested in is the idea where they can use social, as a really at this point what would be like a secondary research methodology. But what they want to do is they want to establish a correlation or meaning between what they're seeing in their offline, customer satisfaction surveys, and then what they're seeing online. And so from a market researcher standpoint, they're really focused on methodologies. So, they have a pretty defined methodology in how they're actually deriving meaning and insights through their offline research and data sources. And they care, number one, obviously, about the methodology with harnessing social analytics data, but then secondly, the ability to draw a correlation between the two. So can we validate then that a particular audience group owns a larger share of voice for a particular topic, based upon what we can see from from offline research, and then using techniques to gather that data via online conversations.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask a couple of other questions that have come in recently, rather than wait to ask them. I think they're good questions, and we can get to them now. And Mike, I'll ask you to chime in also. The question came up using that CRM example, because I think it's a pretty straightforward, well understood example, at least in concept. Some people were asking the questions about, so I've got all of this information that's sitting in my CRM system, which is relatively structured, meaning I can attach it to an individual that is a customer or a prospect or something like that. And social media is so big, right? And there's just so many different posts, right? How do I get to the similar level of granularity, or do I need to get to the similar level of granularity to really get any value? Do I have to drive social media to deeper insights almost at the individual segment level before I then compare it to my social media data, or can I really look at things in the abstract? Love to get your thoughts on that, Mike and Steve.
So I think, yes, one of the advantages with social is that you can start to segment the audience. It may not be an exact alignment with the way you segment some of your other data. So you started out with, Rich, with a CRM example, and the notion that you have individual customer records. Recognize in social that the handles used by individuals may not be their exact names. And so, there are cases where you may not be able to do a direct alignment. But there are other cases where you determine that in the course of the conversation and can establish that linkage between who an individual handle may be and that customer record you may have. Probably more frequently, you'll probably see this in opt-in options, different programs that are run. And I think initially where I'm seeing this from some of the customers are kind of those preferred customer levels. So those customers that you do a fair amount of business with, where, if you're an airline, as an example, they're one of your frequent flyers, that ability to detect them as somebody who's in that elite program that you may have, and then being able to establish that linkage in that particular way. So certainly I think from a CRM perspective or customer record perspective, you're starting to do that. I think when you look at other segments like market research or use cases like market research as an example, what you want to do is to be able to identify, possibly by participation in different sites and what the demographics look like within particular forums or networks that are being used, and also being able to determine some author-level profile information. So, you know, is this a mom who's speaking? And if I'm targeting moms, that ability to segment the mom's conversation and then align that with other market research data I have that's relative to that particular segment is a direction that we see customers going relative to that analysis.
Okay, great. Well, what we'll do here is I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about some of the next steps. And then what we'll look to do is follow up with some of the questions that have come. We wanted to try to keep this to 45 minutes. That seems to be a good time for people. We'll make sure that we follow up with some of the questions that are in the Q&A that maybe we didn't have a chance to get to. But we do want to make sure that we have time to talk about where do you go from here. And there were a couple of questions that came through saying that, you know what, I'm pretty early in the process, and hopefully we'll address some of the things that may interest you in this, right? So where do you go from here, right? What we want to do is talk a little bit about this, and I'm going to open it up after each one of these pillars to our panelists and see if they have any comments at all. But if you're an individual that is sitting in, say, market research, right, and now you're kind of bought into the fact that, boy, I think there is some, you know, opportunity there to combine some data, how do I make this work? Well, we always say the first thing you need to do is really get back to the basics. What are your analytic objectives, right? And if you are able to drive additional insight in these specific areas, what is the business case going to be for that, right? It's difficult to separate that benefit of the analytics based on the data that supports it. So we always recommend just go back to the basics of, if I'm able to answer this question, I'm going to be able to drive this kind of value. And what happens is by layering in additional types of data, it actually just improves your confidence interval, right? So you may go from having a range of, say, the benefit could be anywhere between, you know, A and B, but if you start layering on additional data, your confidence level will go up, and that, you know, variance in your returns is going to get narrower and narrower and narrower, which is what everybody wants. Nobody likes large standard deviations in anything, right? So think about your analytic objectives and think about the ROI around your analytic objectives. How do they align with corporate goals, right, is the next question you should ask yourself, right? And Mike gave some great examples there. He talked about things like brand awareness. You may be a product marketing person that's really responsible for brand awareness, right? You're probably not the only one in the organization that really cares about brand awareness. There are others in the organization that are going to care about brand awareness at a high level. It might be for a different product. It might be in a different functional area. It may be the communications team when you're in the marketing team that cares about it. So think about who shares those goals in the organization and start having conversations with them right away, okay? And you can start to discuss the value in doing some combined analysis with them, and you'll start to get buy-in, right? And then, so I want to stop right there and ask if Mike and Steve, do you have anything to add to that? We're talking about that first step and just kind of understanding your objectives and how important it is. If not, what we can do is we can hold it until the end, and I can move on to the next step there, which is once you now kind of have an idea of who you may share some of these responsibilities with around a particular metric or analytic objective, now you can sit down and you can start to think about the more tactical stuff. What data do we have? Who owns that data? What is the structure of that data? Is it structured or unstructured? And then what tools are being used right now for the analysis? Ultimately, what you're trying to do is set a scope, I think, after going through those first two steps. And our recommendation is when you get started in this, it's definitely walk before you run. Look for a very specific business problem with varied yet very specific data that you may need to get your hands on, right? Don't try to boil the ocean. Keep it very, very specific. So, for example, Mike mentioned competitive positioning is really a key thing from an analysis standpoint, all right? And then that aligns really well in thinking about what type of product functionality do we have right now and what type of product functionality is really required. So like Mike was saying, we may want to sit down and say, boy, what would be ideal is to understand what are the needs of existing customers. That may come through our own community. What are the needs of the market more broadly, which would be an abstract of what the competitive needs are, what are the competitors trying to solve also, and make a comparison between what your customers need, how those relate to the broader market, get a feeling for the gap between those two things, and make the strategic decision, do we want to develop product functionality that will help us secure our own customer base, or do we think there's value in developing new functionality that will help us go after new market segments? That's a really very specific example of how you can compare a couple of things in an effort to really try to move a very strategic objective forward, all right? And then once you've done that, it's really key to build the right team. We can talk about the demographics of these people, meaning are they part of other functional areas? Are they part of your team but maybe working in a different process area? Are they on a different product, whatever it may be? But more than anything else, this is kind of cutting edge stuff. And you're going to run up against things where you may not be able to say as quantitatively as you can with structured data, here's the answer. It's much more like comparing what happens in a focus group, right, to survey data. You need to be open to interpretation and understanding that getting more eyes on it is going to get you a better answer. So the psychographics, I think, of the people that are on the team are critically important. You have to have the data people there, but you also have to have that attitude of social media data is something that really behaves more like focus group data. We'll be able to put questions out there to help us clarify it, but it is less of an X's and O's type of data set than it is, than say revenue is, for example. So build the right team. Cross-functional is critical, but also comprise, some of those psychographics that I like to call out. So those are some of the things that will hopefully get you started. By the time you get to the end of these three things, you should have a pretty good charter for going and selling to your organization for getting started in some of these analytics. Mike, Steve, do you guys have anything to add in closing as far as getting started is concerned?
Yeah, I think you made a good point about not trying to boil the ocean, and I'm a big advocate of the same thing. So, whatever you're trying to frame up, whatever you're trying to look at, go at it, in a sort of a compartmentalized fashion, and I think that leads to a deeper level of understanding and insights relative to, the overall trend or topic that you're looking for. So,
great, thank you. Well, I'd like to say thank you for everybody that joined us. Hopefully it was an informative 45 minutes for you. Again, our objectives, just to restate those, was to kind of give you an understanding of the opportunity of the insight, around the insight that can be derived by combining data sets. Hopefully we gave you some good examples. We gave you some things to think about. Maybe you want to go off and start to talk to people about about business problems and other parts of your organization that may have data that could enhance the insights. And hopefully we gave you some things to think about in terms of getting a project off the ground, keeping the scope tight, making sure you have the right kind of people on it, and you're focused on, really an objective that is very, very clearly defined. Real quick here at the end, in case some of you don't know, Visible is an analytic platform and also a team of professionals that help people derive insights from social media data, and also work with people to derive insights by combining social media with other types of data. We have these series of webcasts about once a month. The next one coming up is going to be in early March, and it's going to be all about an Olympic wrap-up. What we'll be doing is looking for insights in the social media data that will tell us, what happened with the Olympics. What were some of those insights that came out of it? Were people positive about the Olympics? What were some of the themes that came out? Who became some of the big influencers? Who were some of the big names that were really kind of guiding perception around the Olympics? A lot of interesting stuff to see, and we like to use a case study that's really timely, so we're going to go after the Olympics and do a review for people of that. If you want to talk to us anymore about how you can get started, more than happy to share some of that information with you. You can reach out to us at info@visibletechnologies.com, or you can get us on Twitter at @visible, or you can go on our website and you can fill out a contact us or a demo request form. We'd love to talk to you. For recordings of previous webcasts and intelligence reports, you can find all that on our webpage also. So in closing, thank you very, very much for your attendance today. We hope you got something out of this session, and we look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Take care.